Thank you for joining us, everyone. I am thrilled that you are here today for this webinar that we are hosting. My name is Janet McCachran, and I'm the CEO of the Association of Workers' Compensation Boards of Canada. Just wanted to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join today's session. As always, we appreciate your commitment to ongoing learning and the discussion through our first ever combined discovery and operational series webinar today. And we really hope that you find today's session to be relevant and useful. So as I mentioned, today's webinar, it's a first for us in that we decide to combine our usual discovery series, which is a webinar series for our jurisdictional board members, and our operational series, which is for staff of workers' compensation boards and commissions. The reason why we sent this invite out widely is due to the importance and the relevance of the topic to what we felt was our broader audience. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that today's event is organized from our head office, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto, where I am located today, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now on to logistics. Before we get going, I want to mention that we do have our tech support here today, Lombardi. You will see posting in our chat. If at any time you need tech assistance, please feel free to contact via the instructions placed in the chat. We also have a translation tool that we use here at AWCBC. It's called Wordly, and we're using it for today's session. So Wordly allows you to follow along in your preferred language in real time. To use it, you simply click the link in the chat, choose your preferred language, and you'll instantly see the live translation as we go along. We hope that makes the webinar more accessible and engaging for everyone. So will be placing our speaker bios in the chat as well, and we'll monitor for questions through today's session. For the questions, we are utilizing a Q&A. We have so many attendees today, which is wonderful. So we are utilizing the Q&A function in Zoom. If you don't see it, if you go along the bottom bar to the three dots under more, you'll see the Q&A function there. So we're hoping any questions that you have for the end of the presentation, if you could put them in the Q&A function, and we'll use the chat function for all other purposes. Following the presentation, any Q&A, I'll read them out, and we'll get our response from our presenters today. So the session also is being recorded today and will be available on our site along with slides from the session. So if you check back in a day or two, we'll have those there for our members to use. So now on to our presentation. Today we have with us from Wounded Warriors, Scott Maxwell, the CEO, and Dr. Tim Black, who is the National Clinical Director. So what is Wounded Warriors? It is the national mental health service provider dedicated to serving trauma-exposed organizations, trauma-exposed professionals, and their families. Wounded Warriors Canada specializes in providing culturally informed services that utilize a combination of education, counseling, and training approaches to support resiliency and recovery from post-trauma injuries. As awareness of workplace trauma goes, organizations are recognizing that being trauma-informed is no longer enough. The next step is becoming trauma-skilled, building the competencies, structures, and systems necessary to meaningfully support workers experiencing psychological injuries. So I am going to be passing it over to Scott Maxwell, who, as I mentioned, is the Chief Executive Officer, and Scott will then be introducing Dr. Tim Black. So Scott, you'll see his bio in the chat. So Scott is a dedicated public servant, mental health champion, and a not-for-profit leader. His unique experience intersects with public policy, national and provincial government, non-profit business strategy and development. His passion his passion for those who bravely serve Canada stems from his high school friend, Trooper Daryl Caswell from Bowmanville, who was killed in a roadside bomb in Afghanistan on June 11, 2007. Now as CEO of Wounded Warriors Canada, Scott has transformed a local volunteer-based initiative into the national organization that it is today. And so with that, Scott, I will pass it over to you for comments and an introduction to our webinar today.
Well, thank you, Jen. I didn't really know you were going to read my bio, so well, apologies for that, everybody, for the time to get me on and to speak with you. So good morning, good afternoon, kind of wherever you are in the country. Thanks for being here. I'm really just here to obviously thank AWCBC, Janet, the team for having us, and also to set up a little bit of what the presentation is and Tim is going to talk about, but maybe from a different lens, my lens as CEO of Wounded Warriors Canada. And it's the title and the wordy description that you described, but it's the fundamentals of what we're doing nationally at Wounded Warriors, moving beyond trauma informed to trauma skilled, individual policy systems level change. These are real things that we're doing. But I just wanted to be here today to highlight that they're not possible to be done and to be completed without partnership and collaboration and connection. And that's exactly why we're here today to talk to you, to share what it is that we are doing with workers' compensation boards across the country. But mainly for myself to restate that it's fundamentally important, and we've been advocating this for years across trauma-exposed organizations, public safety organizations, those we serve, that we're not going to get systematic and transformational change at all if we don't have willing partners in the effort. And that, how do we get there? We get here because we're together. We're talking about this today. We formally partnered with workers' compensation boards in Alberta, in New Brunswick, recently in PEI, working with WSIB and more to follow. And I know Janet might put something in the notes if you're interested in following up as to what that means, what our partnerships look like. That's where I come in. That's the work that I'm leading alongside Dr. Tim Black, who's doing the heavy lifting of the work, accomplishing our aim. But it's happening and formally happening and structurally happening because of these formalized working relationships that we're establishing from coast to coast. I mentioned Wounded Warriors Canada, our name, Canada, the nation. We don't want to be doing really good things in one geographical location of the country where we know this, despite the scale and the scope, the need is often eerily the same. So we're able to accomplish that. We're doing what you're going to hear from Tim because of these working relationships, and I'm here to foster those, to build those with you, and to help do this work truly at a national level. So with that, and what the work is, and how it is that it's happening, I'll pass over to my colleague, Dr. Tim Black, our National Clinical Director for Wounded Warriors Canada, to get into the nuts and bolts of all the work underway across the country with WCBs.
Yeah, thanks very much, Scott, and thanks everybody for being here and for the invitation to come and present. I'm just going to kick right off here by sharing my screen and getting right into the presentation. Put it into presenter mode so folks can see. And I assume I can only see one or two people here, but please just let me know if you can't see this. Usually when I do a presentation like this, I want to make sure that people come at it with a particular frame. For those of you who've worked with me already and worked with Wounded Warriors Canada from the various organizations, some of this will be a reminder and familiar. I really think about it from the standpoint of I'm going to share with you our perspective and sort of the lens that we look at this issue through is particularly around supporting traumatized workers. If you're already doing these things, wonderful, keep doing it. If there's things you think, oh, I could take that, just steal stuff, take stuff, whatever you can from this, whatever fits and whatever doesn't, then please just feel free to leave the rest of it. So supporting workers with psychological injuries through individual policy and systems level change. We're going to start with some basics here, and it's moving beyond trauma informed to trauma skilled. The big thing for us really has to do with how we start and lay that foundation. So this is what we're going to try and do today. We've got about 45 or so minutes. And the pace, I'll try to keep it relatively quick so we don't, nobody falls asleep. Just talk very little bit about organization. We've already done that. Trauma exposed professionals is a term we use. I'm going to go through. We'll talk about what does it really mean to be trauma informed first, because if we're not talking about the same thing, it's very hard to get anywhere. The difference between exposure and injury, and then really looking through this lens of like, is this thing that we're doing a special thing or is it a standard thing? Moving right up into that system level change, transformation, and action. Very briefly touch on some of our programming and then talk about what we would see a call to action across Canada. Because when I'm working with the different boards and WorkSafes, these are not particular board issues. These are across the board's issue. It's happening all across Canada. So I think if we all come together in a venue like this, I think we can do better by all the folks who serve us. So again, very briefly, we've already mentioned this as a national not-for-profit. We do provide services in both official languages, both on the training side of the house and on the clinical side of the house. So regardless of where you're at, if we have programming that we can deliver solely in French, we have francophone facilitators and clinicians. So that for us is the goal is to make it across Canada in both official languages. Just introducing this idea of trauma exposed professionals so that people can understand what we mean and why. From our perspective, trauma exposed professionals are those individuals who are continually and chronically exposed to actual threat and death, actual threat and serious injury, actual threat and sexual violence as a part of their regular work duties. And the reason why we do this is that language like first responders, veteran, et cetera, like that, there's definitely differences between the various practitioners and the various professions. But the one thing that actually ties them all together, particularly around workplace injury, is exposure to trauma. So trauma exposed professional, or we pronounce it TXP, obviously include, but not limited to all the ones that you see here. I don't need to read them out for you. From our perspective and seeing this across the country, the negative impacts and related injuries from traumatic event exposure is the largest unaddressed and unmitigated risk to TXP mental health in Canada. How do we know this? Because we're working with organizations all across Canada, and we have yet to find an organization that's got it on lock. And we don't say that as a way to blame or point anybody out, just it's a generational shift of looking through the lens of trauma exposure rather than through a lens of, well, what do police need? What do firefighters need? What do paramedics need? What do corrections officers need? Yes, they're all different and they have different circumstances. Again, the one thing that's not being addressed and not mitigated is exposure to traumatic events, and we'll go into what does that definition mean. So we start with this idea of how do we move beyond trauma informed. First, we have to understand what trauma informed is. So if you're on this call, ask yourself the question. We say these are sort of our fundamentals, starting line. What is trauma? And I don't mean that in any sort of facetious way. Like truly, if you ask yourself, what is trauma? Without a clear definition, everybody on the call wants to reduce the impacts, wants to help people who are traumatized. But if we can't define trauma, it's going to be very, very difficult to know if we're preventing anything. So I'll give you our definitions and the reasons why we use them. So trauma in general is not the most particularly helpful term. It's a fairly generic umbrella term for kind of all the bad things that people can experience. And usually people use it as a proxy for how upset someone feels, which there's some challenges around that. So then we have to say, okay, well, what does this term traumatic mean? Because we use this a lot. We like the definition of using this idea of traumatic event exposure. And what this does is it distinguishes between the event and the potential effects that might follow it. And oftentimes people conflate that. How I feel about it is mixed in with whatever event happens to precede it. And that causes some challenges. So people are exposed to traumatic events. They may or may not be injured by them. So what does it mean when something's traumatizing? Well, someone who's exposed to a traumatic event that starts to suffer long-term negative effects, and usually we consider more than 30 days, then we would consider that traumatic event exposure to be traumatizing. So not all exposures are traumatizing. Some are just the job, and everybody who we work with understands this. Yes, most civilians, would be really upset, but some of the stuff, it's just where they live and they work. So if an event causes long-term negative consequences, we consider that event to be traumatizing. And then what does it mean to be traumatized? Well, really, at the end of the day, it's the state of living and struggling with the multiple negative effects of traumatizing event exposure that impacts one's daily living. So again, this idea of PTSD that we all are familiar with. So when we start to look at this language, traumatic event exposure, traumatic events that are traumatizing, when you live with that state, that's what it means to be traumatized. Then we can really start to get some purchase on how do we actually move beyond trauma informed. Most organizations we work with conflate the experience of negativity, like the consequences, and call that's trauma, which again causes some struggles when we're trying to actually treat it. Where does this come from? Well, in our world, in all of our worlds, if we're dealing with workplace injury, PTSD is likely going to be the compensable injury diagnosis that people are going to get. So we've taken the definition straight out of the DSM. I may like in certain parts of the DSM and I may dislike certain parts of it, but this one I like because it establishes this thing happened and now you're feeling this way, which many, most of the diagnosis in the DSM don't do that. So you can see criterion A1, exposure to a traumatic event is defined as exposure to actual threat and death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Exposure is important to understand. In the DSM, there's four different ways that you can be exposed. Most people understand direct experience, someone attacks you, or you're in a car crash. But you can also be exposed through witnessing. So, witnessing a car crash, seeing somebody in a car crash that's quite terrible, you see it firsthand. Hearing about a close friend or loved one. So, hearing that your sister was just in a terrible car crash, you get that phone call, she's on the way to the hospital, we don't know if she's going to make it, if she's alive or dead. That is also considered a traumatic event exposure. And then lastly, I think for a lot of the WorkSafe folks on the call here, indirect exposure through to disturbing details, normally through the case of one's work duties. So again, reading case notes, violent offender files, reading details of child sexual or physical abuse, digital child monitoring exploitation, or even receiving workplace injury disclosures of sexual assault. So when you think through this lens, hopefully you'll see this isn't just for the folks out there who we consider to be operational, but it might actually apply to a lot of the folks in your organizations as well. So we start with this as that's what we consider to be a traumatic event. So we stick very closely to that definition because that's the language that's going to be used if there's ever, and usually with people who have PTSD, this is what they have to endorse. So you can see with this, then the more exposure you have to traumatic events, the higher the risk. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody is traumatized. That's not true. But traumatic event exposure is not unusual in these professions. It is the foundation of the job. If you think about what paramedics go to, they only go to places where there's actual threat and death, serious injury, sexual violence. You think about firefighters, you think about police. That is what we as society want them to do. And so, given that it's the foundation of all these different professions, and given that it's not currently being addressed or mitigated, this is where we get quite passionate about saying we can do better, all of us together. Winter Warriors Canada is not the solution. We're just the ones saying, hey, can we all come together to do this? And just as something to think about here, I said TXP workers are not limited to first responders or military. Many WorkSafe and WCB staff are also trauma exposed professionals given the high volume of traumatic event disclosures to which they're exposed. So if you're listening to a police officer who all of a sudden what we call trauma dumps says on a phone call that, the dead kid or whatever it is they saw, or your job within the WorkSafe organization is to receive disclosures and to go through what happened at work when that terrible thing happened, or what happened when the person was sexually assaulted. So if you have somebody who's receiving disclosures of sexual assault files, 8 hours a day, they're also, by definition, exposed to trauma. It doesn't mean they're all traumatized, but again, as exposure goes up, so does the risk. So trying to define and separate out exposure and injury is really, really important if you're going to start to support injured workers specifically. Especially with trauma exposed organizations, I would consider most WorkSafe and workers' compensation boards to be trauma exposed because they work with people with PTSD and they receive disclosures, is to try to separate event exposure from post-traumatic injury. So by analogy, all the cars would be people in trauma exposed organizations and the water on the left-hand side would be the traumatic events. So yeah, every day they go to work, they're exposed to traumatic events. But as you can see, they're not all drowning, they're not all driving their cars into the water and everybody's sort of being injured. However, if a big wave were to come along, some people would be affected by it. So this idea here is to separate out exposure from injury. And that as the first step to really trying to understand when I'm dealing with folks is don't assume that every exposure you're dealing with, if you're trying to support someone with PTSD, every exposure bothers them. They'll oftentimes feel quite self-conscious that, oh, that one doesn't bother me. And you kind of look at them and go, how can that not bother you? That's just the job. So not everybody who's exposed gets injured. People who are injured have by definition been exposed, and that's one of the most important things that we try to keep doing. So we talk about, so that's sort of laying the foundation. What does it mean to be trauma informed? You can understand there's between the word trauma, traumatic, traumatizing, traumatized. We've established that. So when we talk about trauma skilled, what do we really mean by that? And this goes for all the trauma exposed professionals, quote, out there, outside of WCB and outside of WorkSafe, but it also goes for anybody working with folks who are dealing with trauma and receiving disclosures. So we look at the combined abilities of workers to be able to reliably do this: identify exposure, recognize impacts at the individual and collective levels, track resolution of that, and then down regulate their responses. So there's actually four very core skills that people need in order to deal with trauma and to also understand that if you're working with people with PTSD, this is also something they're going to have to be able to work on and do. So I don't want to separate out helping people with trauma and people who are traumatized because exposure is exposure is exposure, and the same risks are there for both sides of the sort of the formula here. So what do we mean by this? So skill number one, we'd say if you can't identify when you've been exposed to a trauma. So for example, you're working with a firefighter and that firefighter dumps a really intense story on you and you find yourself reacting to that and you think, well, I shouldn't react that way. It's not my story, et cetera, et cetera. That can then lead to sort of issues. And it can also lead to issues in terms of understanding what people are exposed to. So first things, people have to be able to identify exposures. If they don't know what trauma is, they won't know how to do it. So consistently identify exposures to traumatic events is one thing. This is usually on the employer side that we're looking at as well. The second skill people have to have, they have to recognize the impact. So someone has to recognize when one has been impacted by the exposure. Not everybody is. And really understanding that is you're going to get a lot further with this. We hear stories all the time where people assume that the person's just dissociating or they're not really feeling it or they're numbing out. And a lot of the exposures don't bother people because, again, they're trained to do this. Skill number three is you have to be able to track resolution. So reliably being able to track the trajectory of impacts over time. A lot of exposures, the person has a negative reaction and eventually it goes away. So having a reaction doesn't mean you're injured either. It could just mean that you've had what we call limbic response, but be able to track that to see if it goes away. And then the last piece is being able to downregulate your responses. So let's say you have an exposure, you have an intense response to it. Do you have the skills to downregulate their nervous system responses? Now, I'll pause here and just say, in our work, we see three blocks of places where these kinds of things will apply. Obviously, there's the employer side, so the first responder organizations, et cetera. There's the WorkSafe WCB block in the middle, of which we're working with you folks to work on. And then, of course, there's a community health provider. The most unfortunate thing right now is that these three blocks are not aligned on these things. So if we're going to do this well, all three of those blocks need to be aligned on all of these skills for people not to get confused about what they're doing and what they're not doing. So this is fairly high level, and we're just sort of saying these are the skills that we consider to be fundamental to moving beyond trauma informed. Currently, our organization is offering the following supports for each of these. So, in terms of identifying exposures, we in our trauma resiliency trainings, and this is also, again, not just for the employer side, but this is stuff that we've been working with. We just finished a whole bunch of trainings for WSIB, which by all accounts were very well received. Our trauma resiliency trainings. We also have training for leaders being able to identify exposures, know when someone says trauma, what do you mean? And everybody comes out and say, well, traumatic event exposure and then post-traumatic response. Everybody who comes out of this training knows now that those two things are different. For skill number two, being able to recognize the impacts, we teach what's called the better model and the trauma formula. So understanding when responses might come and then understanding at the body. So better stands for body, emotions, thoughts, and relationships. It can get very complicated. So we teach this in terms of learning how to recognize the impacts. And then tracking resolution, we have what's called a 226 protocol we offer up for folks, which is if you've been exposed, after 2 days, if you're still really affected by it, start tracking that. And then after 2 weeks, if you're not starting to come down, little red flags start to wave. If at 6 weeks you haven't come down, meaning you can't think about that event without getting an emotional response and your physiological response happening, we would consider that to be now a sticky event. So whether it's for your staff who are being exposed to those things or trying to understand for folks that they're working with that usually by the time they have PTSD, it's been years. So it's not just 2 days, 2 weeks, 6 weeks. It's now years that they've been struggling with these things. And the longer they've been struggling with the symptoms, the harder it is for them to climb out of that. And last one is down-regulating responses. So we teach what's called our FORGE method, which is just an acronym for using the trauma skilled tools of down-regulation. And then we have one particular that we've developed for operational folks, our down-regulation skills training. So we're really trying to not just say, hey, you need to do this and then figure it out. We're saying, if you're going to do this, here's the things that we've developed. And we try to train folks. Again, we've worked with multiple organizations to help their staff and some even with the community health providers as well. So one of the big things, so I know I'm going fairly quickly, but I really hope we can have some good conversation around sort of some of this applied stuff. One of the biggest things we see is mental health support programs coming in that are special. And we ask this question like, is what you're doing special or is it standard? As a contextual piece for what we see, a lot of mental health wellness programs don't address, and this is what your brain looks like. It's not really, but it's an image of your brain. Um, that there's a part of your brain that is affected by traumatic event exposure that once it's injured, kind of takes over and puts everything else to the side. So when we're talking about workplace mental health interventions that don't directly address the traumatic event exposure piece of it, general mental health programs will be less effective and less impactful. And the reason being is that traumatic event exposure, I would say, sort of metaphorically kicks a stool out from underneath workplace mental health promotion programs, largely because traumatic event exposure kicks in our survival mechanism. And for us as an organism, survival trumps everything. So if you only have mental health promotion and you don't deal with the risks to the survival system is kind of always wins. It's the trump card in the poker game, if you will. So really looking at it from this lens of trauma resiliency training as a standard operating procedure, it also changes the psychology of uptake. So you want people to be invested in this. Most of the people we work with, they have wellness areas, wellness programs that they're struggling to get a foothold. The reason being is that for us, no trauma exposed professional we work with wants to be the recipient of special mental health care or interventions. They're not interested in that. They don't see themselves as special. They just want to serve. They just want to do it. Special oftentimes is special not in a good way. It's special because you can't do what everybody else does. Most of the folks we're working with, they want to be the best at their profession, operating at the top of their game. So if you're trying to get people to invest in mental health, saying, "Hey, we'll be there for you when you get injured and we'll help you take a knee," that's great for people who are injured, but for the majority of people that are working, you're not going to get uptake on that because it says people, "That's not me. I don't need that." Great, you're doing it for other people who need it. I don't need that. And currently, where we're at in terms of supporting workers, and again, this is where when how do we support injured workers? A lot of it has to do with that if we're ignoring the preparation phase of helping people understand this stuff, and all we're doing is putting out fires at the end, that's not the way we support injured workers. We support injured workers long before that. But right now, we see generationally, we're sort of in the pre-latex slash nitrile gloves era of trauma training. So everybody puts on nitrile gloves now if they go into an event. We know that traumatic event exposure is a known workplace kind of health risk or toxin, analogous to like say Hep C or other things in first aid situations. So constant exposure to traumatic events with no training to mitigate the predictable effects is like sending workers to treat bleeding wounds with no latex or nitrile gloves. They don't use latex anymore because of allergies. And I don't think that's overstating it because when you look at the organizations across the country that we're dealing with, there is no standard training to help people become trauma skilled, to move from just saying, "Oh, well, what's trauma?" Well, it's anything that upsets you and that really affects you. That's not true. Traumatic event exposure doesn't always upset people. So we're at a sort of a tipping point in the country where we can actually do an awful lot of good with some fairly low level interventions. Again, nitrile gloves are not complicated interventions, but wow, do they ever help prevent injuries? What we're at right now is people are getting, Hep C, they're getting exposed to other bloodborne illnesses, and we're saying, how do we get them to the right doctor? And I think that perspective needs to shift to yes, of course, if people get injured, their gloves break, get them to the doctor, make sure that they can deal with the infection. But we're at the stage where we need to say, could we do something to prevent this kind of stuff? And that's really what we're advocating for. So from an occupational health and safety standpoint, programs that are viewed as special, usually as extra budget items, are often read by uniformed services, trauma exposed professionals as non-essential. Again, programs required or things required for the job are standard are more likely to be viewed as important. So like things like sidearm training, flak vest, latex nitrile gloves. Like here's your gloves, put them on. Don't go into that accident scene without them. So when we look at it, if you make training standard, and this is again a lot on the employer side, but also within workers' compensation and work safe boards, standard means it's essential. That's how it's read. If you have to do it, it's because it must be important. Special is only for those who need it, and you can see, therefore, it's not for me. So we're really trying to work with, again, employer, WorkSafe WCB, community health providers to say the specialness of your mental health programs is part of why you're having a hard time getting people to take it on. Make it standard, make it required, onboard everybody with that. Again, in terms of that 30,000-foot view, part of why we like the language of trauma exposure is that you think about emergency and crisis response, defining terms. Well, emergency is a serious, unexpected, often dangerous situation. Okay, so there's danger involved. How do you unpack that? Crisis, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. Okay, danger again. So danger is a proxy for what we see as traumatic event exposure. So exposure to actual threat and death, serious injury, or sexual violence. There's not a lot outside of that that is considered dangerous. So what we're offering is just to say, if we use this language, that's how we start to help injured workers. Because if we say it's unexpected, it's actually not unexpected. The emergencies are not unexpected for emergency services folks. And you can ask yourself the question, what emergencies or crises don't involve traumatic event exposure for those workers? So part of helping people who are injured is not just putting out fires, it's helping them find the terms and explain things in ways that actually describe what's going on. Because it's descriptive, it's clear, and it differentiates between the exposure and the injury. We prefer that language and we encourage folks to think about it through that lens. It is the common denominator, connecting professions rather than dividing them. So instead of trying to figure out how you can serve, folks with, and even I would say the injury that you typically see is PTSD. And what I typically say to people is you don't treat PTSD, you treat previous traumatic event exposures that are bothering the person. I mean, that's essentially sort of how it goes. So, which exposure are you working on? Which traumatic event from your workplace are you working on? We know there's differences between professions. Of course there are, but this is the one thing that binds them all together. We see it as the biggest opportunity to actually address workplace mental health for all these professions across Canada. Nick Carlton, who's a stalwart in the policing world, did the RCMP longitudinal study, 12 years tracking this, and 45% of RCMP members endorse a mental health injury. That's one in two. The number of exposures people are dealing with. So understanding that we have a lot that we can be doing that is not, these are not million-dollar solutions in terms of education, helping people learn basic skills, etc. We know that traumatic event exposure at work for trauma exposed professionals, yes, it's inevitable, but traumatic injury doesn't have to be. And right now, we've got far too many injuries, and we should help those folks. But if the solution is to help only people who have injuries, we're in trouble. Largely, what we see is there's three categories of injury. There's career affecting, career altering, and career ending. Right now, there's nothing to help the career affecting injured, nothing to help the career altering injured. What we have right now is people typically, by the time they go down with what we consider to be a career ending injury. We know many people don't return to work once they get injured. I think within 2 years, if you don't return to work, you're likely never going back. We can absolutely do better. So in terms of that system level change at that higher level, three ways that we can do this. How do you help people provide members with clear and understandable education regarding event exposure and predictable effects? This is some of the work we've already been doing with WorkSafe staff. So WorkSafe WSIB in Ontario, we did 7 trainings of about 50 or 80 folks on our trauma resiliency training. So why would we train them? Because if you're going to work with traumatized folks and you don't understand the world they live in, and also if you're receiving disclosures, people who get injured helping others can't help others as well. So we've done a lot of that kind of stuff. So providing that scalable and sustainable trauma skills training. So that down regulation, the ability to recognize it, track if it affects you, see if it resolves itself, knowing that it can, and then, using those down regulation skills as standard, not as, well, if you get injured, remember, if you get injured with PTSD, these skills will still be effective. It's the same ones we use in therapy, but we've missed all these opportunities. We see most people in our treatment programs have been injured for 10 or more years. Some of them have been working 5 years completely injured because they can, and then eventually they go down. And then lastly, that sustainable organizational support for members, staff to learn the information and acquire and practice the skills. Key point here as a regular part of their jobs. So a regular part of the job means you don't have to do it on Friday night after work. So many people say, well, take care of yourselves. Make sure you go for a hike this weekend. Make sure that you eat well. Make sure you drink enough water. All that stuff is fantastic. But that then says it's not important enough for us to do it at work. So if it's not important enough for us to do it at work, it's probably not that important anyways. Or the message is, That's your business. Taking care of your well-being is your business. So trying to incorporate it as a standard operating procedure within the organization, and that includes works. You keep hearing me say, I want to sort of see if we can't break down a little bit of the barrier between the employer, because let's be clear, workers' compensation boards and WSIBs and the WorkSafes of the world are also employers. So even though we separate them in this thing, they also land in the realm of employer. So, what do we offer as an organization? Our trauma resiliency training leadership. We have our before operational stress program, our down regulation skills training. We have peer support fundamentals on the peer support side. We're really trying to set the bar to help everybody get a clear understanding of what this is and then also learn those skills. So, not just if you get the information and you don't change how you do things, that's where we get stuck at trauma informed. We don't move to trauma skilled. Again, some of the work that we've been doing in terms of our training programs, just finished it. Again, I keep saying with WSIB, it's just the most recent one. We've also worked with WorkSafe New Brunswick way back in the day, working and helping them to deal with develop their Succeed program, which is wonderful. I've done some trainings for WCB PEI. Really looking at how do we help folks now start to apply it. So first level training, learn what trauma is, learn how it affects the brain. Second level training that we've been doing with WorkSafes and the workers' compensation boards is actually how do you apply this when you're dealing with someone with PTSD? The same principles all apply. And having those compass points really starts to help folks truly support injured workers in a much more clear way. Oftentimes we get the ask for, can you help me deal with someone who's got PTSD, who's exploding and who's, kind of really, really struggling and they're yelling at me. Yes, we can, but that's not the best way to help folks. Like I said, it's waiting for someone to get hepatitis C and then figuring out what to do when they're upset about it. So training, only focusing on training, so that we don't how to de-escalate sort of belies the point that they shouldn't have to de-escalate or have to escalate that much and then you intervene. If we can put in prevention stuff, the skill is in how you establish the relationship with the injured worker. That's the biggest and most important skill from day one. How do you establish that relationship? How do you actually let them know what they're here for? So that's what we've been doing with the workers' compensation boards. I encourage you to talk to your colleagues in the different boards, see what we've been doing, get their feedback, see what they think about it. They'll be honest with you if they found it helpful. On the clinical treatment and support program side, these are all the ones. You can find them all on our website. These are all what we call no cost to user programs, so people don't pay out of pocket. We currently have some agreements where some workers' compensation boards and some WorkSafes are actually providing funding through the employer to access those programs, at least for their members. But we have programs not just for the members, but for the family, for the kids, for spouses. So please do look those programs up. Just check out the website. You can always contact us directly as well. Um, so to date, and again, I know I'm going fairly fast, but I'm hoping we have some conversation with this around some more pointed questions. We've been collaborating with WC Alberta, WCB Ontario, WorkSafe New Brunswick, Workers' Comp of PEI, and we've been delivering training to staff, as well as some community mental health providers. Both WorkSafe New Brunswick and WC Alberta have brought me in to do, and Woodward is in to do some training to support the folks out there doing the work of trying to support the workers. So very briefly, in terms of the things that we see as essential for the work safes and the workers' compensation boards is your staff need to know what trauma is. I usually start every training with what's trauma, and then I ask people to give me their feedback. And it's actually not just workers' compensation. It's every organization working with what is trauma. And what's fascinating to me is that people can't really define it before the training. They think, oh, it's anything that overwhelms you. It's anything that, you have nightmares about and that you can't get out of, all that kind of stuff. And so what they're describing is they're describing post-traumatic responses. And then I say, okay, without describing how it affects someone, what is a traumatic event? Like, how would you describe it? And so the biggest thing that we really try to say in terms of supporting all workers across this, having your staff, having the employer's staff, the injured workers, having the community health providers really understand traumatic event exposure is one piece of the puzzle. Post-traumatic responses is the second piece of the puzzle. And then how we respond to folks is the third piece of the puzzle. So I know it's a fairly high overview. We didn't have the time in a short webinar to get into the things, but largely what we're trying to do in training staff is reduce the intensity and frequency of people, kind of exploding in anger or being hard to get a hold of. The last thing that we've been doing in the training is really teaching about avoidance. So much what we hear is, I can't get a hold of the person. They're not engaging. Like, how do I get them to engage? If you don't understand what's going on, if you don't understand what that part of the brain, that limbic part of the brain I mentioned earlier, the survival mechanism, if you don't understand how that survival mechanism works, trying to prevent and deal with avoidance and non-engagement is very, very difficult, and some well-meaning interventions may actually backfire. What we try to teach staff is what works for traumatized people also works for non-traumatized people. But what works for generic mental health sometimes can backfire spectacularly for people who are traumatized. I'll give you a concrete example just before we finish up. Um, if you've been taught that if someone's getting angry, just let them vent for a little bit. Yep, for non-traumatized people, usually they'll vent for a little bit, maybe get a little bit angry, and then they'll say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I know you're just doing your job. I didn't mean to raise my voice. Like, I know you're trying your hardest. I'm super frustrated." Great. However, if you let someone with PTSD who's starting to spiral up vent, they will not come back down. Typically, they will spiral up and up and up until it's that big kind of explosion. They'll slam the phone down, and then you'll have a hard time getting a hold of them. And then for your staff, how excited are they for the next conversation with that person? So, what we would say is that actually, for people with PTSD, the worst thing you could do is let them vent. Letting them vent, especially once that survival mechanism kicks in, typically doesn't end well. And then, even from a compassionate standpoint, they may spend the next 3 or 4 days just spiraling until maybe the next time they can see their care provider. So those are little things, very, very practical things we're trying to help people see and understand that once you understand how trauma works, even if that's the sort of standard way that you do it, it will also work for folks who aren't traumatized, but it doesn't work in reverse. So, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, we do have formal partnerships right now with the following boards, and we've had some discussions with other boards as well. The formal partnerships really for us are just we as an organization that asks people to trust us with their donations. When WorkSafe New Brunswick says we've partnered with them, that sends a message to the community that Widow Warriors Canada is trustworthy enough to partner with. That helps our charitable side because our charitable side is where we deliver all of our no cost programs. So the more public facing partnerships we have, the better it is for us because as a charity, we rely on those donations. So if we could make a call to action to everyone on the call, the first one is provide all trauma exposed professional workers with standard education in recognizing workplace exposure to traumatic events. If everybody gets it, that's the great starting, including all of the folks who are working with traumatized folks. Give them trauma skills training to mitigate the impacts of workplace exposure. Same thing with workplace staff, case managers, et cetera, return to work folks. And then provide employers with support incentives to make trauma skills a sustainable and standard expectation. So we know that there are some responsibilities to sort of help educate and inform employers. Employers have responsibilities. We haven't really touched on the community health providers, but if we could get these three calls to action, that is the best way to support injured workers because just dealing with the blowups actually will not help. And it's still just having people get very badly injured. And then as a skilled trauma therapist, I would like to believe, yes, I can deal with people blowing up with PTSD. I know how to de-escalate. I don't want to spend my time doing that because that means there's so much stuff that's happened before that that we could have done to prevent the big blowups. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop sharing my screen if people have questions. That's 9:45. I'm really looking forward to please ask any question. I'm not saying we'll have the answers, but I'm going to stop sharing and then we can hopefully hear from folks. And I know, Jenna, you've been tracking the questions, etc.
So just to thank you, Tim and Scott. Tim, as always, it's such an engaging presentation, such an important topic. And I know, you've got a lot of information you put in such a short amount of time, and we could have hours of conversation on this for sure. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for Scott or Tim, if you could put it in the Q&A. We do have one from Andrew from Newfoundland, though, and he said, what is the recommended way that you can disengage with someone if they're, as you mentioned, the spiraling up? So if, not allowing them to vent, if that's not how they recommend it, what
Mhm.
is a way that you can help to bring that down?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, there's some of the other sort of more specific trainings. What we don't want to do is get into that because if we do if people choose that training, then they won't choose the other stuff. But having said that, with that caveat, I say this. If somebody is escalating, is I will typically just say if their name is Steve, say, so Steve, I really want to help you. I'm really going to try and help you with this. I'm not going to be able to help you if we keep going down this road. So is there a way that we can come back to sort of having that discussion where I can get to helping you? And if Steve says, you people, like I always learn working with WorkSafe, the you people accusation is one that really lands. Like, you people say you're here to help. You're not here to help. You're just here to help yourself. I would just keep saying, Steve, I really want to try and help you with this, but we can't keep going at this level. And if Steve is going so far that he can't even hear you, I've actually worked with people to say, so I'm sorry, Steve, I'm going to hang up now. I still really want to help you. I said, and please feel free to call, but we can't keep going down this road. I don't think it'll be helpful for you or for me. So is there anything, and if Steve's just still spiraling, the best thing to do is to very politely and compassionately sort of end the call, because anything you try to insert at that point, if this person who we're talking about is so injured, is just going to be grist for the mill. So it's not a matter of slamming the phone down and saying I'm not going to talk to them multiple times. I try to use the person's name, and I try to use a tone, if you can hear, like the tone where what we call that's a down regulation. So you can see you get into the weeds pretty quickly here, which is why we don't do this, because if I teach everybody how to do this and nobody changes the stuff that prevents that, it's kind of like a lot of work. So I could do that fairly comfortably, and I would feel comfortable ending that call even if Steve is still yelling at me. Again, nobody deserves to be verbally abused. Nobody deserves to be yelled at, sworn at, called names. And so I would say when you're ready to talk, please give me a call. And if I don't hear from you, I will call you at 9 a.m. next Thursday. And if all that call is recorded and it goes to your manager, I would say you tried, you were calm, you used the persons, you expressed your desire to try and help them, um, and they still escalated up. Say, okay, I'm hanging up now, and you just hang up. And then next Thursday at 9, you make sure you phone them. That's as good as we can get. But hopefully you can see that's not the goal, is to teach everybody how to do that.
Andrew said that's helpful. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Okay. Thank you.
So we have another question. It's Amy asks if you mentioned recovery strategies at work versus self-care on the weekends. What kinds of things can employers do around these at work for recovery strategies?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest thing that we recommend oftentimes is track traumatic event exposures in number per shift, train people in what we call our down regulation skills, and create a culture where that's just standard practice. Like I say to paramedics, what would you do with a rookie paramedic who, when someone bleeds inside the ambulance, just walks away and doesn't clean the ambulance? Oh, I tell them to go back and clean the ambulance. They say, so that's our goal for this stuff. Where the senior people say, did you actually track your traumatic event exposure, and did you do what we call a better check? So a better check is it affecting me at the body level, the emotional level? Is it rolling around inside my head? And am I feeling like I want to isolate from my coworkers? When that becomes the same as cleaning out the ambulance, then we'll have success. If it's like, I'll come around to put my arm around you and check and see if you're okay, everybody we know will go, yeah, yeah, good, please, I'm good. Just let me go home. So that's what we keep saying, having it as a standard thing, track the numbers of exposures, require people to, as a professional, do a better check. I'll give you the analogy, long-winded answer. Working with police and tactical folks, because they wear dark clothing during firefights, they do what's called a wet check after a gunfight. And a wet check is checking for blood. It's not a matter of, oh, hey, I got this special intervention for you to see if you're going to bleed to death. Do you want it? And the person goes, no, I don't need it. I'll just come. Like, they don't do that. They check each other. They check their clothing and then they see, is there anything on them? The better check is a psychological wet check post-exposure. You've been exposed. Exposure is a risk. So when someone goes into a nuclear facility, do they have the option to take off their hazmat suit and go shower? No, that's the professional standard. So that's what we're trying to encourage people to say, is like, we need to raise the professional standard, knowing these are workplace toxins. So it's for new people, it's not even a thing where they don't even know that there was a time when people didn't wear nitrile gloves, because there are still people who remember, police officers who remember going out without their flak vests when they were walking on the streets with no protection, paramedics who remember going into and helping people with no nitrile gloves on. Nobody even thinks about it. That's our goal.
Excellent. And Nam has a really good question here. how does your trauma training address cultural differences
Hmm.
and how trauma is experienced, expressed, and responded to? That's a really good question.
For sure. So the thing about trauma is, of course, we start at the survival mechanism. So right, as far as we can tell, the survival mechanism operates predictably across cultures, across genders, across everything, because it's about survival of the species. And then, as you rightly said, how it gets expressed, like we have to train people sometimes for, I'll give you just an example that's maybe not the cultural sort of reference you're thinking about. So many first responders are taught to suppress their emotions to do their job, and they're really good at it. So I have to train my clinicians that if you see somebody's lower lip start to quiver, that could be the same as some other civilian person bursting into tears. So that expression, depending on what you're dealing with, you have to be very mindful. And then you have to be mindful of being able to give people the ability to check. So the limbic system typically works the same so far as we can tell. And again, I'm willing to be corrected on this, that it doesn't work differently across cultures, genders, or anything. That survival mechanism for the human is the same. So when you're working with folks, depending on where their culture, what gender they're coming from, understanding that how you see it may not look the same. So you may have this person who, from this cultural background, they just don't express emotions. Other people who might express a lot more emotions. Some people are very verbal, some people are, and so understanding that if you do the survival piece right, usually that's when people will start to kick in and self-regulate. So I said, what works for non-traumatized people doesn't always work for traumatized people. If you get the survival mechanism to stand down, then it's like everything else you would do. You would talk to the person. What's that like for you? And how do you experience that? And what's that been like for you at work? How's that been? If you don't do the survival piece, none of that stuff matters because again, survival trumps everything. It trumps everything that comes after it. I would say, not to be too pedantic, but in our model of the brain, the survival mechanism, the limbic brain is core to everybody staying alive. Everything else that we're talking about in terms of like identity, culture, meaning, value, that's all higher order, what we call cerebral cortex stuff. Important, yes, but this always takes precedent. So what we're going to say is, let's just try to get this part right, so then you can just deal with the other stuff like you would with anybody else. I hope that answers folks' questions.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Well, we wait to see if there's any other questions. I don't see any others right now. So you've mentioned the partnerships, and I know there's quite a few of our member jurisdictions are really interested in those partnerships, and those
Right.
conversations are going on. And so if they're interested in reaching out, Scott, best to reach out to you to have that
Yeah,
discussion.
I'll throw my name and my email and that and phone number in the chat right after this, or like right now, and then please reach out at more further explanation, templated. We're not reinventing the wheel anywhere, so we don't go in and say we're going to be doing something out west that we're doing something differently out east. The format is in the templated document, and partnership experience is the same, and then it gets into the nuanced discussion around their needs because every board
Mhm.
is looking at doing things similarly, but a bit different in approach with terms of who the clinicians and Tim are working with, which is great and understood. But generally, around the partnership, we're following the same path, just on a national level. Oh, thank you, Aaron, for putting that's my email,
So
and Tim's email there. So you got it.
yeah, so anyone who's interested, and that goes partnership, but it would also go for any training, individual training.
Yeah,
So
a partnership is not required for for training. It's we went the other way. We used to traditionally we've gotten numerous requests just to train and do things here and there, which we did and fulfilled. But then we've taken it to the next level and a bit more of an advocacy position from our standpoint is let's train early and often. Let's not do these one and done end of fiscal. I found an extra bit of money kind of approach to what we've seen historically, not within just WCBs, but within the trauma exposed professional community writ large. This is how the approach to training and psychological health and safety has been treated. And I think we're trying to say like the way to actually do it right is foundational. So you go to the partnership perspective first. It's a great news story for the entire compensation board, for the community it's serving, ultimately for the injured workers. And then we get to defining what we're going to do together.
and also, on top of that, I know there's a number of conferences that go on throughout the year that you're involved with. So is there opportunity of
Yes.
folks that are interested in that as well?
So for sure, let me just while I'm going to throw this little link in the chat right now. So we have three annual first responder mental health conferences. I'm just throwing it, there you go.
Perfect. Yeah.
That link is the landing page for all three. So we just finished Ontario for Central Canada. in April this month. Geez, it feels like it was a lot longer. It was a couple weeks ago. And then we are moving and prepping for our Atlantic First Responder Mental Health Conference in Charlottetown, June 2nd and 3rd. And then we head out west to where to Tim's location and on the island of beautiful Victoria for the Western Canada First Responder Mental Health Conference. So we've really taken that regional approach, kind of dividing the country up in three different areas, obviously. And these are phenomenal events, really focusing on these kinds of conversations, learning, innovating, best practice, try not to be redundant or reinvent wheels where there's solutions exist. Bringing the mental stress injury program teams from the compensation boards together, sometimes for the first time in person to really strategize and learn off each other, much less across the community. So if you can make it to any one of them, please register.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I've talked to a few this week who are quite excited about signing up and attending those conferences. So that's
Great.
wonderful. So I'm cognizant of our time. I want to thank you both again. Like I said, this was a very informative, very timely conversation to have. I'm seeing comments coming in about how much our members have appreciated this. And for those on the call, we're always looking for other opportunities where we'll engage with wounded warriors. We at AWCBC see this to be a very valuable partnership, and we'll continue with this. As always, those that attended today, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. If there is any other topics or any other comments you have, please reach out to me afterward at janet@awcbc.org, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
And Tim and Scott, I'll ask you to stay on at the end if you don't mind.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.